Good morning. My name is James Reaves, and this is my first time preaching at the Cathedral. My wife, Amy Forsberg, and I have been members here for about 4 years, and perhaps you have seen me act as a verger or Eucharistic Minister, or seen us together on Altar Guild. I have the humble honor to be a postulant for the diaconate for the Diocese of Maryland, and am in the formation process to be ordained, God willing, and the people consenting, in 2021. As I travel through this process, I often look at things from the perspective of a deacon. An important part of a deacon's responsibility has been described as being a bridge between the church and the world, bringing Christ to the world and bringing the concerns of the world to the church. Someone once described the role of a deacon as nagging the church when something was wrong and needed the church's attention. For those who don't know me well, I love railroading and have the pleasure of working in the industry here in Baltimore at MTA's Light Rail. 20 years ago, I was very active at the B&O Railroad Museum. One of my jobs there was teaching the volunteers to work safely with our vintage railroad equipment, preparing them to work as brakemen and conductors on switching moves and our passenger trains. While preparing to start a new class, a woman volunteer named Anna asked to be part of the class. Up until then, the students have all been men. There was no logical reason for this, but that's how it was always done. I immediately welcomed her into the group. At about the same time, a volunteer who had an intellectual disability named Derek asked to be in the class. While I knew Derek might not be appropriate as working on the train crew, I agreed to allow him to attend the course. At one point during the classes, Derek recognized that he couldn't be a brakeman, but he told me he was grateful that he could take the training. To be sure, there were no rules against women and people with intellectual disabilities taking these training courses, but it wasn't the normal way things were done at the museum at that time. My position, particularly regarding Derek, was we are a museum and not a working railroad company. What was the harm? While I received positive feedback of having these non-traditional students, there was also some grumblings from other volunteers. Can you remember a time that you acted against the status quo? How did it feel? What made you decide to do it? In my situation, at the museum, I welcomed Anna and Derek into the railroad skills class because it was the proper course of action, as I knew I was treating people as equals and giving them the same opportunity as any other volunteer. How do we prepare ourselves to take on issues that are outside the status quo? In a broader sense, when something is wrong, why and how do we react? By look at Jesus' example, we'll have a context to follow. I was acting against the status quo at the museum, and that is what Jesus is doing in today's gospel, and often in his ministry. The gospel lesson this morning tells the story of a time when Jesus acted against the norm and the reaction of those who didn't believe Jesus could or should do what he did. The leader of the synagogue was offended that Jesus healed this woman on the Sabbath and addressed the other congregants saying there were 6 days to work and to come to be healed on those days, but not on the Sabbath. Jesus countered with, wasn't it perfectly acceptable to leave your livestock to drink water on the Sabbath? Certainly this woman is more important than an ox or a donkey. This wasn't the only time Jesus healed on the Sabbath. The Gospels are sprinkled with similar stories. And in many of these cases, the Pharisees were using these incidents against Jesus, claiming in part he was not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Since Jesus threatened the established order and the authority of synagogue leaders, the Pharisees were using these incidents as evidence against him. So why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath? While Jesus didn't break the Sabbath, he went regularly to synagogue, he didn't have much use for inflexible rules. Jesus strongly believed, and not without reason, that in his interpretation of the law, healing on the Sabbath was permitted. Jesus also had to know he was stirring up the pot exposing himself to accusations from the Pharisees. I'd like to think Jesus acted so boldly in part because he felt a physical ailment was also a spiritual one, and to free someone from a physical problem was also freeing their faith and reverence towards God. At some point in our lives, we have all had the flu or a bad cold. How devout did you feel when you had a temperature of 102 degrees? Well, having the flu isn't comparable to being unable to stand for 18 years, and I don't mean to be impertinent, but you can see how a physical matter can affect your spiritual side. So far, I've talked about the legalistic and theological reasons Jesus healed on the Sabbath, even at great risk to himself, but doesn't really answer why. It's quite simple, really. Jesus let nothing, tradition, law, or even Rome, stop him from performing his ministry. And Jesus' ministry was demonstrating God's love to as many people as he could in the world. He did this through expressing love, compassion, mercy, generosity. Jesus was proclaiming what the kingdom of God would look like, not only to the people in Judea in the first century, but to us 2,000 years later. Jesus' mission, his purpose, was to show God's love to as many people as he could. Jesus was also providing, 2 millennia ago and almost 6,000 miles away, a blueprint for us on what we are expected to do as followers of Jesus Christ. As I travel through the formation process, I often look at things through the lens of a deacon's ministry. I think Jesus was acting then as deacons are called to act now by challenging the leaders of the time to do what was right, to understand people are more important than rules. Like Jesus, deacons must sometimes speak truth to power. All baptized Christians are called to ministry. As followers of Jesus Christ, we must emulate him in our interactions with the world. We are called, every one of us, to act boldly in the face of injustice, hunger, poverty, cruelty. We all have different gifts, and we are called to use these gifts in the service of the church and God's people. So help cook a meal at a soup kitchen, visit a shut-in, contact your representative in Washington or Annapolis and express your position. Teach a class about racial injustice. Look a homeless person in the eye and ask their name. Write a letter to the editor. Donate to the Episcopal Policy Network. Attend a rally. Work with Erica. Be kind to everyone you meet. Be like Jesus on the Sabbath. Amen.